Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're talking about hand sanding. I've had a ton of people ask me what my process is more in depth. Now, I've talked about hand sanding, mirror polishing in some past videos, but I wanted to kind of break down how I do my hand sanding from right off the grinder to where it needs to be depending on what finish you're going for. So I'm actually working on 3 of these baby sharks. Now this is a collaboration with Gunstone Creations, and you can see I'm doing a full mirror polish on these. And this one came out really good. I've got another one kind of chalked up here in the hand sanding station, and I'm going to kind of just break down my process, and maybe you guys can pick up a couple tips. All right, so here is the knife we're going to be hand sanding today. You can see kind of where that finish is at on this side now. What I do is, as far as belt progression goes, this is at about a 220 final grit, and then I did just a light Scotch-Brite finish on this one. I actually was thinking about leaving these belt satin, but doing full mirror is way cooler. So, you know, what I like to do is bring it up to 220 before hand sanding. Now, people ask me, why don't you bring it to 400? Why don't you bring it to 800 on the grinder? And I find that when you buy those higher grit belts, they are expensive and they don't last long enough to make it worth your while. To get this from where it's at 220 up to a hand sanded 800 isn't that big of a deal. So that's at least why I do that. So you can see this side, I have it ready for polishing, and this is hand sanded to 800 grit, rough 800. You can see I didn't do any sort of, what would you call it, like finishing passes, to where if you were gonna leave this hand sanded finish, I would clean that up a lot. But there you can see it. And we're gonna take this side up to that same finish and show you guys how I do it. So it's going to be really difficult to show you guys, but I'm going to try my best to get some different angles so you can see kind of what this looks like. So I've got it clamped down to my little spot that I hand sand. And if you take your bevels to 220, I always start hand sanding with a 220. That way you can even out those. Basically, you're just trying to get rid of those vertical scratch lines and get them all horizontal. So I use like this little piece of micarta that I cut and squared up. And I just take my sandpaper, kind of wrap it around there. And I'm gonna show you guys something. If you do just a few passes here, I'm gonna change the camera and you can kind of see what I'm talking about with the horizontal versus the vertical scratches. This doesn't take very long to really show up kind of where you miss spots on the grinder. Let me take this and change it here. Okay, let's see if I can get this to focus. So you can see, like here, all of these. Oh, right here, you can see it really good. Okay, so here's your grind lines from the grinder, and you can see my horizontal scratches eliminating those. So that's the first step. Now, if you did a good job on your grinding, this step doesn't take very long. A lot of times what I see is I will not take long enough with the 120 grit belt when I'm doing my final grinds, and I'll end up with some 60s left in here. And then when you move up to the 220, you're really not helping yourself. So when you're grinding these, when you know you're going to do a hand sanded finish, you know, use fresh, clean abrasives. Take your time, slow down, and make sure you're really getting rid of all of those previous grind lines with your next finer grit. So what I'm going to do is try to get rid of all of these vertical lines And this won't take very long, especially this is just high carbon steel. It sands really easy compared to a lot of the stainless that I've been doing lately. And you can see I just keep wrapping the sandpaper around this. As long as you're not up right next to that plunge, this works just fine. So I'm kind of just looking at where there's still vertical lines and kind of attacking those portions. Now obviously on this tiny little blade, this is pretty easy to do. And that's why I thought it'd be a good one to make a video on, because I can get it done and kind of not be sanding for hours in one spot and trying to do some big long chef knife. But just like that. Now I've got a couple little scratches. It's really hard for you guys to see, but a couple scratches here and a couple right up by the plunge. You'll also find that when you're doing this, the scratches right up by your plunge are a little trickier to get out. And what I like to do is, like I said, use this little sanding block and get it really tight wrapped around there. And you can just really get up in there good. And takes a little bit of time, but you'll get them out. And you just have to make sure before, like for example, this is 220 grit sandpaper. Before you move on to your 400, you've got all of those 220 grit scratches out. That's the main thing. You don't want to miss a scratch and move on to a finer grit. So, all right, I'm going to finish getting up to this 220. You can kind of, hopefully you guys can kind of see what I'm doing. I'm really focusing on that plunge because I still have those vertical lines I'm trying to get rid of. I've got the rest of the blade to where it's good. So once I get these in, I'm going to show you guys a couple other little tricks that help me get this finish right. All right, so just a few minutes later here, and I've got my 220 grit done. Okay, so let's see if I can get kind of a close up so you guys can see. It's very rough. It's not even or anything like that, but all of the scratch lines that are going this way are gone. And that's all I'm trying to do with that 220 before switching to 400. So another good tip for when you switch grits, like right now I'm going to switch to 400. Now I put all of those horizontal lines in with my 220 passes, and now a really good thing, especially if you're a beginner at hand sanding, is instead of going this way with the blade, you can go vertically with it. Now what you're kind of trying to do, it's the same thing, is now we're going to eliminate all of those 220 grit scratches we just put in, and going against the grain, you're able to make sure that you're eliminating all of the 220 grit scratches. And this is something that I don't typically do anymore, but if you start out doing this, it will show you kind of how much sanding you actually have to do on each grit to get rid of those previous scratch lines. And it's always a little bit more than what you expect. So this is just a tip for if you're kind of new to hand sanding, and it's a good way, it's kind of a foolproof way of, you shouldn't move on to the next grit until you've got all the scratch lines out that are going the opposite direction of what you're currently doing. So let's see if I can move the camera and kind of show you what this looks like. All right, there, it's zoomed in really good. So you can see now there's vertical lines going in towards the tip. You can still see those 220 scratches up at the top right here. You can see them, but I'm gonna do a couple more passes with the 400 going vertically, and all those 220s will be out of there. Now sanding like this on this tiny little blade is kind of annoying. And again, I wouldn't normally do it, but it's a really good way to just make sure that you're not going to have to go back and start back at a certain grit, which is super annoying. If you're all the way up to 800 and you miss the 220s, some 220 scratches, it's really frustrating. So this is a good way to do it, and you can really see where you're missing. Like I can see up at my tip, there's quite a few, and right by my plunge, there's still quite a few that are those 220s that I just put in. So I'm going to continue with this, and then we're going to switch to 800. All right, 800 time. Now 800 goes pretty quick. Kind of the finer the grits, the quicker they go. And same idea, we're going the opposite direction of the 400s. And we're going to get rid of all of the scratch lines. And we're almost done. Very fun stuff. Now, I guess depending on what kind of steel you're working with, what kind of finish you're actually trying to get, would depend on how far you want to take this. So for me, I don't really do many hand sanded final finish blades. I think they look really, really good, but I just don't really do many of them. So for example, this one is going to go to the buffer and get mirror polished. So that final finish on this doesn't have to be perfect, because the buffer will kind of dial in those really light 800 grit scratches. Now, if you were wanting to do an actual hand sanded finish, you have to kind of slow down and make some really nice final passes, kind of the where you go up to your plunge and make nice even strokes away from it. And it takes a little bit of practice, but it can come out really, really nice, and a little tricky to get to where you don't have those little J hooks and little scratches, but just tinkering with it, you'll get it for sure. But all I'm trying to do is get this whole blade up to 800 grit, and it doesn't have to be 100% perfectly clean, as long as it's all at 800. So that's my goal right now before I can take it over to the buffer. Now, even for if you're doing like a Damascus blade, like a high carbon Damascus, I've been taking all of those to mirror polishes now. I found that whether you're using like Baker Forge steel, Alabama Damascus, any of those kinds of things, it really, if you take it all the way to a mirror and then do your etching cycles properly, it gives your final contrast a lot more definition. And because a lot of people say, oh, with certain Damascuses, I only take it to 600 grit etch, and the higher you go, this and that. I haven't found that myself. I'm sure depending on some steels, like with Alabama Damascus, you can get really good results just taking it up to 600, 800, etching it, no buffing. It looks pretty good. But recently I've been taking it full mirror, and it sure looks a lot better. So getting a good set of buffers, I think, is really key to this. Now, if you're doing, like I said, if you're just going to do this and leave it at a hand sanded finish, you might not even have to take it to 800. I know a lot of people that do a hand sanded finish and leave it at 400, and it's a little easier to get a nice even kind of finish throughout the whole blade. So again, you'll have to just kind of tinker with that, but this video is more about just kind of the progression and how to know when to move on to the next grit. And I don't know, it's a little bit boring. Hand sanding, everybody will say, is probably the worst part of the whole knife making process, but you have to just kind of know that it's part of the deal if you want to put out a nice knife. I mean, there's a lot of people that, and I do as well, I can do a off the belt finish that's nice. Stone wash is nice, but I think if you're going to make knives, you need to know how to do a nice hand sanded finish. So anyways, that's my rant on that. I'm going to finish this up, and I'll show you guys kind of the final result. All right, So here's where I'm at. It's pretty close to good. It's all at 800. You can see I've got a little scuff there at the tip, right? I don't know, kind of can see it right there. You could definitely get out with about 2 passes, but again, this is going over to the buffer, so I'm not too worried about that. Again, this is kind of a boring video. That's why I've never made one of these, but I get people that ask me all the time, especially when I started doing all these mirror polishes, is what my hand sanding progression looked like and just kind of how I do it. So that at least showed you guys kind of a rough, kind of beginner, how to hand sand a knife. There's a lot of different ways to go about it. There's a lot, people get real picky with it, and I don't know, I would say I'm kind of middle of the road, especially because I'm not doing a ton of hand sanded finishes. But this finish right here up to about 800 or 1200 gives me a smooth enough finish to get a mirror polish off those buffers. So that's what I'm going for, and hopefully that maybe helped you guys out a little bit. Sorry, let me take these headphones off. So if that helped you, make sure you like this video. If you're new to the channel, go back and check out all my other videos. I pretty much covered every process of knife making. So if you're a new knife maker or been doing it for a while, you'll probably find some value in my videos. So again, thank you guys for watching. And like always, make sure you subscribe.